This is a true story, but the names of the characters have been changed. What would you do if the life you dreamed of came crashing down? Follow Lily's incredible journey from a small-town childhood filled with struggles to a whirlwind of love, betrayal, and tragedy. In this heartfelt story, she shares how she found strength in loss, rediscovered herself, and started over against all odds. A story of resilience, hope, and the power of second chances. Watch to the end for a lesson that will stay with you forever. My name is Lily, and I grew up in a weathered house in the Royal South, the kind of place where dreams often stay just that, dreams. Our home sat at the edge of a forgotten town, a few miles off a dirt road that turned to mud with the slightest drizzle. The roof leaked every time it rained, and in the winter, drafts blew through the thin walls, forcing us to huddle around a space heater that groaned louder than a tired old dog. The yard was more weeds than grass, and the rickety porch was a hazard waiting to happen, but it was all we had, and even that felt like more than some of the neighbors could claim. The neighborhood itself was a patchwork of small, dilapidated homes, many of them owned by families just barely scraping by. Some parents worked 2 or 3 jobs, while others had given up altogether, spending their days on the stoop with a cigarette in one hand and a distant look in their eyes. It was the kind of place where the sound of children laughing was often drowned out by shouting matches inside the houses, or the occasional blare of sirens late at night. Most people didn't dream big, they were too busy trying to keep the lights on and food on the table. I was raised by my grandmother, Edna, after my mother left when I was too young to understand what abandonment meant. Edna was already well into her 60s when she took me in, a time when most people would be slowing down and enjoying the fruits of their labor. But for her, life had never been about enjoyment. It was about survival. She worked as a cleaner at the nearby truck stop, coming home every evening with the smell of bleach clinging to her hands and her face drawn with exhaustion. Edna didn't believe in handouts or pity, not for herself and certainly not for me. She ran the household with a strictness that left little room for affection. Idle hands are the devil's playground, she'd often mutter, handing me a mop or a basket of laundry to fold. By the time I was 8, I knew how to patch holes in my own clothes and stretch a pot of beans and rice to last 3 days. Dinner was always something simple, canned soup if we were lucky, or bread and lard if we weren't. The poverty we lived in wasn't just about material things. It was a weight that pressed on you, making every decision feel heavier. At school, I was painfully aware of the differences between me and the other kids. My hand-me-down clothes never fit quite right, and I often found myself shrinking into the background, hoping no one would notice the scuffs on my shoes or the lunch I brought, usually just a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. I envied the kids who got to eat hot meals from the cafeteria or wore new clothes that didn't smell like someone else's perfume. Our life was a constant balancing act. One bad week, a missed shift at the truck stop, or a higher-than-usual utility bill could throw everything into chaos. Edna would do what she could, but there were times when we had to rely on the kindness of neighbors or the church pantry. I remember one particularly hard winter when our power got cut off. We spent 2 weeks living by candlelight, boiling water on a propane stove just to stay warm. The shame I saw in Edna's eyes during those days is something I'll never forget. She didn't complain, but her silence spoke volumes. Despite it all, Edna believed in self-reliance. She didn't trust the government or charity, and she certainly didn't want me growing up with a sense of entitlement. If you want something in this life, you work for it, she'd say, her voice firm but not unkind. It was her way of instilling resilience, though at the time it felt more like a reminder of what we didn't have. Our community wasn't much better off than we were, but there were moments of camaraderie that kept us going. Mrs. Jenkins down the road would sometimes bring over vegetables from her garden, and in return, Edna would help her fix her broken fence or sew up a torn dress. People shared what they could, though it was rarely more than a gesture. Still, those small acts of kindness reminded me that even in the darkest times, there was light to be found. Looking back, I see how those years shaped me. Poverty has a way of teaching you lessons no classroom ever could. I learned the value of hard work, the importance of resilience, and the necessity of hope, even when hope felt like a distant luxury. I also learned that kindness could be found in the most unexpected places: a smile from a stranger, a warm bowl of soup shared on a cold night, or the encouragement of a teacher who saw potential in a shy, awkward girl wearing second-hand clothes. Through it all, I dreamed of escape. Not because I hated where I came from, but because I knew there was more to life than just getting by. I imagined a world where I didn't have to ration shampoo or worry about the electricity bill. I dreamed of a home where love was abundant, where laughter wasn't overshadowed by worry. Those dreams became my lifeline, carrying me through the toughest moments and reminding me that my story didn't have to end where it began. I was 18 when I met Mason. He wasn't like the boys I'd grown up with in our small southern town, where most people's lives were as patched together as the roads that wound through it. Mason was kind and soft-spoken, with hands that bore the calluses of a mechanic's life, but a smile that softened every worry I had. He worked at his dad's garage, a modest shop just off Main Street, where the air always smelled of oil and sawdust from the makeshift bench Mason had built in the corner. It was a summer evening when we first met. I was walking home from my part-time job at the diner, my apron folded over one arm and my feet aching from hours of taking orders and pouring coffee. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. I'd just turned the corner near the hardware store when I heard a voice behind me. "Need a ride?" I turned to see Mason leaning out the window of an old Chevy truck, its paint faded and the bumper held on with duct tape. His smile was easy, but there was something genuine in his eyes that made me stop. "I'm fine," I said, though my feet begged me to say otherwise. He nodded, but didn't drive off. "I see you walking this road all the time. Just thought you might appreciate a lift." No pressure. I hesitated for a moment before climbing into the passenger seat. The truck smelled faintly of motor oil and pine air freshener, and the radio was tuned to a country station, playing an old George Strait song. "I'm Mason, by the way," he said, offering his hand as if we were meeting at a fancy party instead of in his beat-up truck. "Lily," I replied, shaking his hand and trying not to laugh at the formality of it all. From that night on, Mason seemed to find reasons to cross paths with me. Sometimes he'd stop by the diner, ordering a coffee and pie just to have a reason to sit at the counter and chat. Other times, he'd drive by as I was walking home, offering me a ride even if I only had a block left to go. "You work too hard," he'd say, shaking his head as I climbed into the truck one evening. "What's the point of being young if you can't enjoy it a little?" I'd laugh and shrug, too used to working to imagine anything else. As summer turned to fall, Mason and I became inseparable. We'd spend evenings driving down the dirt roads outside of town, the windows rolled down and the warm breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and freshly cut grass. Sometimes we'd park by the river, sitting on the tailgate of his truck and watching the water ripple under the moonlight. One night, as the crickets chirped and the stars seemed to stretch endlessly above us, Mason turned to me with a serious look in his eyes. "Lily," he said, taking my hand in his, "I don't have much." "You know that." "But I promise you, if you stick with me, I'll do whatever it takes to give us a good life. I'll work my hands to the bone if I have to. Just tell me you believe in me." I squeezed his hand, wanting so badly to give him the answer he deserved. "I believe in you, Mason," I said, and I meant it. But deep down, there was a part of me that couldn't stop dreaming of more. Our town was small and stifling, the kind of place where people's lives seemed preordained. Most girls I knew had already settled into the rhythm of it, marrying their high school sweethearts, raising kids in tiny houses, and working part-time jobs while their husbands worked the fields or the factories. For many, that was enough. But for me, it wasn't. Mason could sense my restlessness. He'd catch me staring off into the distance, my thoughts somewhere far beyond the rolling hills and winding roads of our little town. "Where do you want to go, Lily?" he asked one night as we sat by the river. "If you could go anywhere, where would it be?" I thought for a moment, my mind racing through images of places I'd only seen in books or on TV. "Somewhere big," I said finally. "New York, maybe. Or Chicago. A place where you can be whoever you want to be." Mason nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Then we'll go," he said simply. It was moments like that when I felt like maybe I could believe in us. He had a way of making the impossible seem just a little more possible. But as much as I loved him, there were always doubts gnawing at the edges of my heart. Mason was good and kind, but he was also content in a way I couldn't be. He didn't mind the idea of staying in our town, taking over his dad's garage, and building a life there. For him, love and hard work were enough. For me, they were just the beginning. One evening, as the first hints of winter crept into the air, Mason and I drove out to the old oak tree at the edge of town. It was a spot where we often went to talk, the branches sprawling out like a sheltering canopy. As we sat there, wrapped in a blanket and watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mason turned to me with a look I'll never forget. "I love you, Lily," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it. Whatever it takes, I'll make it work. Just say you'll stay." I wanted to say yes. I wanted to promise him that love would be enough, that I could be happy with the life he was offering. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. "I love you too, Mason," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know if I can stay." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of my words hanging between us. Mason didn't push me for an answer, and for that, I was grateful. But I knew that night marked a turning point, one we couldn't ignore. Life in Charleston had always felt steady, almost rhythmic. Mason and I had built a quiet life together, a modest home on a tree-lined street, dinners at the kitchen table, and weekends spent hiking trails near the coast. It wasn't grand or extraordinary, but it was ours. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was missing, a void I couldn't quite name. Then came that crisp autumn morning. The kind where the leaves crunched underfoot and the air smelled faintly of salt and cinnamon. I had dropped Mason off at work earlier than usual. His job as an accountant often demanded his attention, especially during the quarterly rush. Left with a rare, open morning, I decided to treat myself to my favorite cafe downtown, a cozy spot tucked between a bookstore and a boutique florist. The cafe was bustling as usual, filled with the hum of conversations and the hiss of the espresso machine. As I scanned the room for a table, my eyes landed on him, Ethan. He was impossible to miss, even in the crowded space. Sitting by the window, he exuded confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention, but naturally drew it. His tailored navy suit, perfectly knotted tie, and sleek leather briefcase spoke of a man who belonged to a different world. At first, I ignored him. Why wouldn't I? People like Ethan existed in movies, not in the world I knew. But then, as I waited for my latte, I felt his gaze. Not intrusive or aggressive, but curious. When our eyes met, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that made my heart skip a beat. I quickly looked away, feeling a warmth rise in my cheeks. I found a table near the counter and opened my laptop, pretending to work while stealing glances in his direction. That's when he approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Mind if I join you? The place is packed." I hesitated. Sharing a table with a stranger felt oddly intimate, but I couldn't bring myself to say no. "Sure," I replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. He sat down, setting his coffee on the table. "Thanks. I'm Ethan, by the way." "Lily," I said, forcing a polite smile. "Lily," he repeated, as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "That's a beautiful name." The conversation started innocently enough. We talked about the weather, the cafe, and Charleston's charm. But as he spoke, I found myself captivated. He had a way of weaving stories about his travels, skiing in the Alps, sailing in the Caribbean, negotiating deals in New York City. His world was so different from mine, and I was both fascinated and envious. An hour later, as I packed up to leave, he slid a business card across the table. "If you ever want to escape your routine," he said, his tone light but inviting, "call me. Everyone deserves a little adventure now and then." I tucked the card into my bag without replying, unsure if I'd ever use it. Over the next few weeks, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could feel, with Ethan lingering in the back of my mind. Mason and I continued our routines. Dinner conversations revolved around work, bills, and our shared Netflix queue. I loved Mason deeply, but our life felt predictable, almost scripted. One afternoon, as I cleaned out my bag, Ethan's card fell onto the counter. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my fingers tracing the embossed letters of his name. I told myself I wouldn't call, but the thought of seeing him again was intoxicating. The next morning, I found myself back at the cafe, half hoping and half dreading that Ethan would be there. And he was. This time, he approached without hesitation. "Lily," he said, his smile warm and familiar. "I was hoping I'd run into you." We talked for hours, and by the end of the conversation, he invited me to a charity gala at the Ritz-Carlton. "It's nothing serious," he said, sensing my hesitation. "Just an evening of good food and great company. You deserve that." It was a crisp Saturday evening in late November when I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Charleston Royale, one of the most luxurious hotels in South Carolina. Ethan had insisted I wear the shimmering gold dress he'd sent over earlier that week, a dress so elegant and expensive, it felt like it belonged in a fairy tale. As I walked alongside him, the room seemed to glow with an almost magical brilliance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, laughter and conversation buzzed around us, and the soft clinking of glasses blended into the background like a melody. Ethan carried himself with such ease in this world, nodding confidently to people I'd only seen on the news or in magazines, real estate moguls, philanthropists, even a senator. For a moment, I felt like a star in his orbit, and it was intoxicating. He leaned in close, whispering names and anecdotes about the attendees, making me feel as if I were a part of this glittering world. At one point, Ethan guided me toward a small balcony just off the ballroom. The music faded into the background as we stepped into the cool evening air, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He handed me a glass of champagne and gazed at me, his expression soft but intense. "Lily," he said, his voice low, this life, this world, it's where you belong." I've never been sure of anything. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt like I was playing a role in someone else's fantasy, but another part, the part that longed for escape, wanted to believe him. When he pulled me into his arms, I didn't resist. His words, his touch, even the faint scent of his cologne, it all felt like a dream, one I wasn't ready to wake up from. As he whispered promises of a life filled with luxury and passion, I let myself be swept away, if only for a moment. The drive home that night was quiet. Ethan had offered to let me stay at his penthouse downtown, but I insisted on going back to the small, familiar house I shared with Mason. The contrast between the two worlds was stark, the glamorous life Ethan offered versus the steady, predictable life I'd built with Mason. When I walked through the door, Mason was waiting for me in the living room, his laptop open and a cup of tea in his hand. He looked up and smiled, but there was a hint of worry in his eyes. "Hey, you're back late," he said, his tone light but curious. "I was at a work event," I lied, slipping off my heels. It ran longer than I expected. Mason nodded, not pressing further. That was one of the things I loved about him, his trust, his patience. But as I watched him return to his laptop, a pang of guilt hit me so hard it nearly took my breath away. Over the next week, I found myself caught between two worlds. By day, I was the devoted wife, running errands, cooking dinner, and laughing at Mason's jokes. But at night, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan, his charm, his confidence, the way he made me feel alive. Mason noticed the change. "Lily," he said one evening as we sat on the couch, the TV playing quietly in the background, "you've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" I froze, my heart pounding. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." His kindness was unbearable. It made me want to confess everything, to fall into his arms and beg for forgiveness. But the truth was, I didn't want to give up the life Ethan had shown me. The following weekend, Ethan invited me to spend the day with him in New York. He had a private jet, he said, and wanted to show me his favorite art gallery in Soho. It was a whirlwind trip, filled with rooftop lunches, shopping sprees, and stolen kisses, in the back of a sleek black car. By the time we returned to Charleston that evening, I knew I couldn't keep living a double life. When I got home, Mason was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. He looked up as I walked in, his face lighting up as it always did when he saw me. "Hey, I thought we could try that new recipe you found online," he said, holding up a cookbook. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend anymore. "Mason," I said softly, my voice trembling. He set down the knife, concern flashing across his face. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath, the weight of my decision crashing down on me. "I think we need to talk." We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals, so many dreams. I told him everything, not about Ethan, but about my feelings, my doubts, my yearning for something more. Mason listened quietly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. When I finished, he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, hurt, confusion, and a deep, unshakable sadness. "Lily," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I don't understand." "I thought we were happy." I thought I had enough. Tears streamed down my face as I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you." A week later, I packed my bags and left for the city with Ethan. As the taxi pulled away, I glanced back at the house one last time. Mason was standing on the porch, watching me leave. His shoulders were slumped, his face etched with pain. It was a breezy afternoon in early December, the kind where the air hinted at the holidays, and Charleston's cobblestone streets buzzed with life. Ethan and I were seated at a cafe near Marion Square, one of those trendy places where the baristas knew your name, and the pastries were overpriced but irresistible. We'd met there before, always choosing a corner table by the window. It felt private enough, like our little secret. That day, Ethan was particularly attentive, brushing a stray hair from my face, pouring sugar into my coffee with a theatrical flourish. I could feel the envious glances from a group of women seated nearby, their eyes flicking between Ethan's tailored jacket and my designer scarf, one he bought me just last week. For a moment, I let myself revel in it. This was the life I'd dreamed of, the kind of life where charm and sophistication masked the chaos underneath. Then everything changed. The cafe door swung open with a force that sent the bell above it jangling loudly. A woman stormed in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. At first, I didn't think much of it. Charleston was full of people rushing to meet deadlines. But then her eyes locked onto me, and the air seemed to shift. She was stunning, in a way that only made her fury more striking. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her makeup flawless. She walked straight to our table, her heels practically cracking against the floor. "You," she hissed, her voice low but trembling with rage. "You've got some nerve." Confused, I looked at Ethan. His face drained of color, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked ordinary. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't give him a chance to answer. She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "I'm his wife." Time froze. Wife. I stared at Ethan, waiting for him to deny it, to tell me she was mistaken. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting into something cold and unfamiliar. "She's lying," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with practiced nonchalance. "Don't listen to her, Lily. She's just trying to make a scene." But the woman wasn't done. She slammed her hand down on the table, making my coffee cup rattle. "Don't you dare," she snapped, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at him. "You think you can keep doing this? Parading your little flings around town like I don't exist?" Flings. The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. "I didn't know," I stammered, looking between them. I didn't know he was married. Her eyes softened slightly, but only for a moment. Then she leaned closer, her voice lowering to a venomous hiss. You didn't bother to ask, did you? You just saw the money, the charm, and you went along with it. How convenient. People were staring now. The cafe, once filled with the soft hum of conversation, had fallen silent. I could feel the weight of their gazes, their judgments pressing down on me. Ethan, ever the performer, suddenly stood up, throwing his hands in the air as if he were the victim. She came after me, he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. I didn't ask for this. I tried to tell her no. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What? I gasped, my voice shaking. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was addressing the crowd, painting himself as the hapless husband, the innocent man caught in a web spun by a scheming woman. She wouldn't leave me alone, he said, shaking his head as if disappointed. I told her I was married, but she kept pushing. The room seemed to spin. My cheeks burned as whispers rippled through the cafe. Unbelievable, someone muttered. She doesn't even look ashamed, another voice said. The woman, his wife, looked at me one last time, her lips curling into a bitter smile. I hope it was worth it, she said, her voice laced with disdain. Then, with one swift motion, she grabbed my arm, yanked me out of my chair, and dragged me toward the door. Let me go. I protested, stumbling as she pulled me outside. But she wasn't done. Under the glaring afternoon sun, she unleashed a tirade of insults, each one cutting deeper than the last. She called me names I wouldn't dare repeat, accused me of ruining lives, and painted a picture of myself so vile, I barely recognized it. Ethan didn't come to my defense. He didn't follow us outside. When I glanced back through the cafe window, he was already sitting down again, casually checking his phone as if nothing had happened. The humiliation was unbearable. People walked by, some stopping to watch the spectacle, others whispering to each other. When she finally let go of my arm, I stumbled back, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know, I said again, my voice breaking. She stared at me for a long moment, then left, a sharp, hollow sound. They never do, she said, before turning on her heel and walking away. That night, I packed up everything Ethan had ever given me, the dresses, the jewelry, even the scarf I'd been so proud to wear. I threw it all into a box and left it outside his apartment door. I couldn't sleep. The image of his wife's face haunted me, along with the cruel indifference in Ethan's eyes. How had I been so blind? So naive? The next morning, I texted him, "We're done. Don't contact me again." He didn't reply. For weeks, I stayed home, avoiding the places we'd gone together, avoiding the friends I was too ashamed to face. I didn't tell Mason what had happened. I didn't think I ever could. But even as I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the pull of the life Ethan had shown me. The luxury, the excitement, it still lingered in the corners of my mind, like a ghost of the person I thought I wanted to be. And that was the bitterest truth of all. When I walked away from Ethan, I thought I'd left behind the allure of his world, the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. But as the weeks stretched into months, I realized that the void he'd left behind wasn't just emotional. It was also the seductive promise of a life I'd only glimpsed, a life where money flowed freely, champagne bubbled endlessly, and every night sparkled like a new beginning. Charleston's charm became a backdrop for my new reality. The quaint cobblestone streets I once loved now felt suffocating. The cozy home I shared with Mason, now long gone, seemed like a relic of a past life. To fill the emptiness, I turned to what I thought I had left, my looks, my charm, and the fleeting validation I could find in the attention of wealthy men. Derek came into my life at a rooftop networking event in Atlanta. It was one of those gatherings where everyone wore designer suits and spoke in clipped, confident tones about stocks and ventures I couldn't understand. I was there on a whim, invited by a friend of a friend who thought I'd enjoy the scene. Derek was magnetic. Late 40s, impeccably dressed, and carrying the aura of someone who was used to getting his way. He approached me with the kind of confidence that makes you feel chosen, special. "You're far too elegant to be standing here alone," he said, handing me a glass of champagne. Within weeks, Derek whisked me away into his world, a whirlwind of private jets, exclusive resorts, and designer shopping sprees. He promised me everything: a penthouse overlooking the city, a life where I'd never have to worry about bills or responsibilities again. At first, it was intoxicating. But there were rules. Always subtle, but impossible to ignore. Derek had a vision for me, one that didn't include my independence or personality. My wardrobe, my hairstyle, even my conversations were carefully curated to fit the image he wanted to project. "I need you to look perfect for the gala tonight," he'd say, laying out a gown he'd chosen for me. "You represent me, after all." The first time I stayed at his sprawling mansion in Buckhead, I couldn't sleep. The house was so pristine, so cold, it felt like living in a museum. I'd stare out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens, wondering if this was really the freedom I'd been chasing. It was at a gallery opening in Charleston's French Quarter where I met Brian. He was the complete opposite of Derek, an artist with an untamed energy, the kind that seemed to electrify the room. His paintings were bold and chaotic, and so was he. Brian didn't promise stability, he promised escape. He spoke in riddles about life, passion, and the pursuit of authenticity. He made me laugh, made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. "Lily, you're a muse," he'd tell me, sketching my silhouette on the back of a napkin during one of our late-night escapades. With Brian, the world felt vibrant again. He took me to parties where musicians jammed until dawn and poets recited verses under dim, flickering lights. But those parties were always filled with people vying for attention, their laughter often masking insecurities and egos. Over time, I realized Brian's world was as hollow as Derek's, just wrapped in a different package. For all his talk of freedom and art, he cared deeply about the same things Derek did: money, status, and admiration. His words, once so charming, began to feel like rehearsed lines. I wasn't blind to what I was doing. I knew these men didn't love me. They loved the version of me they'd created, the arm candy, the perfect date, the muse who would stroke their ego and melt into their world without resistance. And in a way, I loved what they represented: wealth, glamour, and the intoxicating illusion that I was part of something bigger than myself. But there was a cost. With Derek, I felt like a doll, polished and posed for his convenience. With Brian, I felt like a fleeting muse, destined to be replaced by the next bright-eyed admirer. Each relationship chipped away at pieces of me I'd forgotten how to protect. I'd lie awake at night, replaying the choices that had brought me here. Was it the allure of Ethan's promises that had started it all? Or was it something deeper, a fear of being ordinary, of living a life where I blended into the background? There were moments when I thought about walking away from it all. When I'd sit in the back of Derek's Rolls-Royce, staring out at the city lights, or when Brian would leave me alone at a party to charm someone else. I'd think about Charleston, about Mason, about the version of myself that used to find joy in simple things: a quiet morning with coffee, a walk along the harbor, a love built on trust instead of transactions. But those moments were fleeting. The glittering world I'd stepped into was hard to leave, even as it hollowed me out. The thought of returning to a life without the sheen of luxury was terrifying. Is this who I am now? I'd whisper to myself in the darkness, the question lingering unanswered. By the time I realized how far I'd fallen, the person I used to be felt like a distant memory. My relationships were fleeting, my ambitions shallow, and my sense of self tangled in a web of material desires. And yet, I couldn't stop chasing it. It's a strange thing, clinging to something you know isn't good for you. Like standing on a sinking ship, watching the horizon and hoping for rescue, even as the water rises around you. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: the life I'd chosen was unsustainable. It sparkled on the surface, but underneath, it was empty, fragile, and bound to collapse. Looking back, the final chapter of my descent into this hollow life came with Todd. I never thought much of him when we first met. He was just another wealthy businessman in a suit who promised adventure and excitement. But there's something about that type of man that lures you in, especially when you're already drowning in the emptiness of your own choices. He was younger, a bit cocky, and he didn't try to impress me with over-the-top displays of wealth like Derek. No, Todd was different. He was smooth, calculated, and knew how to make you feel like you were the only person in the room. I first met Todd at a business gala in San Francisco, one of those black tie events where everyone pretends to care about philanthropy while secretly checking their stocks on their phones under the table. I'd been invited by a mutual acquaintance, and Todd had caught my attention with his sharp wit and his effortless charm. He knew all the right things to say, made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just another pretty face in a crowd. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that told me he was calculating, sizing me up, trying to figure out what I could give him, and what I could be for him. I could see through it, yet I stayed. I was numb, and maybe a little bit desperate for validation. A few weeks later, Todd invited me to Las Vegas. It was a whirlwind trip, just the two of us staying at one of those ultra-modern hotels on the Strip. You know the type, rooms with floor-to-ceiling windows, views of the fountains, and the constant hum of the city outside, but inside, the air felt cold. We partied in the most exclusive clubs, popping bottles of champagne, surrounded by people who were all living for the moment, forgetting that this lifestyle was just a temporary fix for something deeper. Todd promised me everything I'd wanted. He promised me freedom, and more importantly, he promised me that my past mistakes would be forgotten in the neon glow of this new world. It was around midnight when the atmosphere in the club shifted. We were at the VIP table in the back, the music thumping in our ears, the lights flashing. Todd, ever the showman, kept looking at me with that playful smile, saying things like, "You're too beautiful to hide away, Lily. You deserve to be seen." I didn't think much of it at first. But then, as the crowd grew louder and the lights dimmed, I noticed people whispering. Todd leaned over to me, smiling even more, as if he knew something I didn't. Suddenly, the massive screens on the walls lit up with footage, images of me. Images from when Todd and I had been alone together, laughing, kissing, the moments we shared behind closed doors. But they weren't just innocent moments, they were private, intimate snapshots of me at my most vulnerable. It felt like the ground fell out beneath me. There I was, exposed, vulnerable, a spectacle for everyone to watch. The club went silent for a moment before the whispers and laughter started to build. The crowd's eyes shifted toward me, some in curiosity, others in judgment. I stood frozen in place, unable to move as the sound of mocking laughter filled the space. "Look at her, she's just another gold digger," one voice said. "Didn't take long for her to show her true colors," someone else muttered. I could feel the weight of every eye on me. The shame was suffocating. I thought I could hide, disappear, but no amount of money, no designer dress could shield me from the truth that had been exposed for all to see. I glanced at Todd, hoping for an explanation, a defense, anything. But instead, he just looked at me with a smirk, as if this was all some game to him. He didn't care about me. He didn't care about my dignity. To him, I was just a means to an end. I don't know how I managed to make it out of that club. My feet moved, but they were disconnected from my mind. The laughter still echoed in my ears as I stumbled through the casino, through the flashing lights, the sounds of slot machines, the voices calling out to me, none of it real. I walked down the Strip, but I wasn't there. I don't even remember the path I took, just that I needed to escape, to get out of that world, that life, those people who had been nothing but cruel and empty to me. I don't remember how I ended up back at my hotel room, but there I was, curled up on the bed, my phone ringing off the hook with messages from Todd, people I used to know, all of them acting like they didn't just see me humiliated. In that moment, alone in the cold, sterile hotel room, I realized just how far I'd fallen. How many mistakes I'd made in the pursuit of something I thought would fix me, something that would fill the emptiness inside. Instead, it had only amplified it, left me exposed and broken in ways I couldn't reverse. The next morning, I tried to pull myself together. I told myself I was stronger than this, that I could walk away from this chapter, this life, and rebuild. But deep down, I knew the truth. The price of my actions, the choices I'd made to gain a fleeting taste of luxury, had cost me far more than I ever anticipated. What had I really gained? Temporary pleasure, empty promises, and a life that I didn't recognize. I was a shell of who I once was, hiding behind makeup and designer labels, chasing something I thought I deserved. But I was wrong. The shame that Todd inflicted upon me in that club wasn't just public humiliation. It was the final nail in the coffin of the life I had been living, shallow, opportunistic, and ultimately lonely. I don't want to be the kind of person who looks back and only sees the mistakes. But it's hard not to, when you've been used and thrown away so many times. The harsh reality is that the life I had been chasing, full of extravagant promises, false love, and empty validation, was nothing but a trap. As I walked out of the hotel that morning, the sun shining too brightly in my eyes, I realized that there was no quick fix for the pain I'd been carrying. No amount of money, no number of fancy outfits, no glamorous parties could heal the damage. I had to face the consequences of my own choices, no matter how hard they were to accept. But I also knew one thing: I couldn't go on like this. It had been months since I'd finally stepped away from the chaotic life I'd been living. The glitter and allure of the luxury I once chased had dulled, leaving behind the stark realization of how far I'd fallen. I was trying to rebuild myself, but it was a slow and humbling process. One chilly October evening, I found myself at a charity gala in downtown Charleston. It was held at a grand event space near the waterfront, with tall glass windows that reflected the soft glow of string lights outside. The room buzzed with polite conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the occasional bursts of laughter. I hadn't planned on attending. It wasn't exactly my scene anymore, but a colleague at the small nonprofit where I'd started volunteering insisted I come. "You need to put yourself out there, Lily," she'd said, nudging me with a grin. I was standing near the buffet table, absently sipping on a glass of sparkling water, when I felt it, a presence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just nerves. But when I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. There he was. Mason. He stood across the room, deep in conversation with a group of sharply dressed men. But he wasn't the Mason I remembered, the young mechanic with grease-stained hands and a kind, quiet demeanor. This Mason was polished, confident, exuding an air of success that I hadn't expected. His tailored navy suit fit him perfectly, and his once shaggy brown hair was now neatly styled. Even from a distance, I could see the faint lines of maturity on his face, but they only made him more striking. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. My mind raced, and I thought about slipping out of the room unnoticed. But then, as if he could feel my gaze, Mason turned. Our eyes met. And just like that, time seemed to slow down. There was a flicker of something in his expression, recognition, surprise, maybe even sadness. But it was fleeting. He composed himself quickly, giving me a small, polite smile before excusing himself from the group and walking toward me. "Lily," he said when he reached me, his voice steady but soft, with that same warmth I remembered. "It's been a long time." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "Mason," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You look, well, still as beautiful as ever." The compliment caught me off guard, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. "Thank you." You look good too," I stammered, instantly regretting how clumsy I sounded. He chuckled lightly, a sound that was both familiar and foreign. "Life's been kind to me," he said, glancing around the room. "Though I didn't expect to see you here." There was no malice in his tone, but his words carried a weight that wasn't lost on me. I felt a pang of guilt, remembering the way I'd left him, the way I'd let ambition and greed tear apart what we had. I've been trying to start over, I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. His expression softened, and for a moment, the air between us felt heavy with unspoken words. "Starting over can be a good thing," he said finally, his tone sincere. As the evening went on, we found ourselves sitting at a small table near the corner of the room, away from the crowd. Mason told me about his journey since we last saw each other, how he'd gone back to school, earning a degree in engineering while working long hours to make ends meet. He talked about the startup he'd launched, which had grown into a successful company specializing in sustainable energy solutions. "I wanted to build something meaningful," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Something that could make a difference." I couldn't help but admire him. This was a Mason I'd never known, a man who had found his purpose and thrived. But beneath his confident exterior, I could still see traces of the man I once loved, the man who had always been quietly thoughtful and deeply kind. "And you?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "What have you been up to, Lily?" The question felt loaded, and I struggled to find the right words. "I took some wrong turns," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I let myself get caught up in things that didn't matter. But I'm trying to change that now." Mason nodded, his expression unreadable. "We all make mistakes," he said after a pause. "What matters is what we do next." As the night wore on, the conversation turned lighter, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times. We laughed about shared memories, like the time we got caught in a sudden rainstorm during a hike, or the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner we once tried to cook together. But there was an unspoken tension beneath it all, a shared understanding that things could never go back to the way they were. When the gala began to wind down, Mason walked me to the door. The crisp night air was a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom, and for a moment, we stood in silence under the glow of the streetlights. "I'm glad I saw you tonight," Mason said finally, his voice quiet. "Me too," I replied, my heart aching with a mix of emotions I couldn't fully name. As he turned to leave, I called out to him. "Mason?" He paused, looking back at me. "I'm proud of you," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. A small smile tugged at his lips, and for the first time that evening, it reached his eyes. "Thank you, Lily," he said. "Take care of yourself." And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the night. As I walked home, the sound of the city fading into the background, I couldn't stop thinking about Mason. Seeing him again had stirred something in me, regret, yes, but also hope. He had rebuilt his life, found a way to turn his pain into something meaningful. And while I couldn't change the past, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could do the same. That night, as I sat by my window watching the city lights, I made a promise to myself. It was time to stop running, to stop chasing illusions, and to start building a life that was real, a life I could be proud of. Because if Mason could find his way back to himself, then maybe, so could I. It was a crisp November morning when Mason reached out to me after the gala. I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. Part of me wondered if our conversation that night had been a polite closure to the chapter of our lives where we once belonged together. But there it was, a simple text message. "Would you like to grab coffee sometime?" No pressure. My heart raced as I read it. I stared at my phone for what felt like hours, debating whether I should say yes. But deep down, I knew the answer before my fingers even typed the reply. "I'd like that." We met at a small cafe on King Street, the kind of place where the chairs didn't match, and the baristas wrote quirky quotes on the chalkboard menu. Mason was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table with a cup of black coffee in front of him. He looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, the noise of the cafe seemed to fade. "Hey," he said, standing up and pulling out a chair for me. It was such a simple gesture, but it reminded me of the Mason I used to know, the man who had always been quietly thoughtful. We talked for hours that day, the conversation flowing as easily as it had in the past. Mason shared more about his journey, how he'd poured himself into his work after our breakup, channeling his pain into building something he could be proud of. But it wasn't just his career that had changed. He talked about therapy, about learning to forgive himself for things he couldn't control and finding peace in the little things. It wasn't easy, he admitted, stirring his coffee absently. There were times I didn't think I'd get through it. But I realized that holding on to anger or regret wasn't helping me. So, I let it go. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. I've been trying to do the same, I said softly. It's not easy. No, it's not, he agreed. But it's worth it. As the weeks passed, Mason and I began to spend more time together. It wasn't anything extravagant, just walks along the Battery, dinners at quiet restaurants, and lazy Sunday mornings browsing the farmer's market. Slowly, I started to let my guard down, allowing myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserved this second chance. One evening, as we sat on a park bench overlooking the water, Mason turned to me, his expression serious but kind. "Lily," he began, "I want you to know something." I held my breath, unsure of what he was about to say. "I don't care about what's happened in your past," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever choices you made, whatever mistakes, I'm not here to judge you. I see you for who you are now. And to me, you're still the same woman I fell in love with." His words hit me like a wave, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Mason, I don't deserve this," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Of course, you do," he said gently. "We all deserve a chance to start over. If you want that with me, I'm here. But only if it's what you want." That night, I went home and sat by my window, staring out at the city lights. Mason's words echoed in my mind, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope. The next day, I met Mason at the park again, this time with a clear decision in my heart. As we walked along the path, I took a deep breath and said, "I want to try. I want to start over." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached his eyes, lighting up his entire face. "Then let's do it," he said simply. Starting over wasn't easy. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the weight of my past felt too heavy to carry. But Mason never wavered. He supported me, encouraged me, and reminded me that the person I was becoming mattered more than the person I had been. We didn't rush into anything. Mason had his life, and I was still working on rebuilding mine. But we made time for each other, slowly weaving our lives back together in a way that felt natural and right. One afternoon, as we sat on his porch sipping tea, he looked at me and said, "You know, I think the best thing about second chances isn't what you get back, it's what you learn along the way." He was right. Looking back, I'm not sure how I got so lucky. Mason didn't have to forgive me, didn't have to open his heart again after everything I'd done. But he did. And in doing so, he taught me the value of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but also forgiving myself. Our second chance wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and choosing to move forward together. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The days I spent with Mason after our reconciliation felt like a balm to my wounded soul. He had this way of making the world feel lighter, of reminding me that even after everything, I was still worthy of love and kindness. Mason didn't just accept me, he lifted me, gently encouraging me to rebuild myself piece by piece. We'd settled into a rhythm, weekend hikes along the trails of Ravenel Bridge Park, lazy afternoons spent cooking together in his kitchen, and quiet evenings on his porch, watching the sunset over the marshlands. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly home. One crisp December morning, the weight of a secret I'd been carrying finally became too much. Mason was sitting at the breakfast table, his hair tousled and a warm smile on his face as he sipped his coffee. I knew I couldn't keep it from him any longer. "Mason," I began, my voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you." He set his mug down, his expression shifting to one of quiet concern. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, tears already welling in my eyes. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His face softened, but before he could respond, I continued. "It's not yours. The baby, it's from a time before we reconnected." The silence that followed was agonizing. I couldn't meet his eyes, afraid of what I might see, anger, disappointment, rejection. But when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, filled with a tenderness that shattered my defenses. "Lily," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand in his, "this doesn't change how I feel about you. Whether the child is mine or not, I want to be here for both of you. We can make this work, together." His words broke me in the best way. I dissolved into tears, falling into his arms as he held me tightly. For the first time in years, I felt truly loved, not for who I pretended to be, but for who I was, flaws and all. Over the next few months, Mason and I began planning our future. He insisted on accompanying me to every doctor's appointment, learning as much as he could about pregnancy and parenting. He was there for every milestone, every fear, every moment of doubt. "Lily," he'd say whenever I questioned myself, "you're going to be an amazing mom. And we're going to give this child the love and stability it deserves." Mason didn't just talk about being a father, he embraced it. He spent weekends building a crib, picking out books for bedtime stories, and even debating baby names with me late into the night. His excitement was contagious, and for the first time, I allowed myself to feel hopeful about the life growing inside me. As we grew closer, Mason began introducing me to his world. He brought me to family gatherings where his mother, a retired schoolteacher with a warm laugh, immediately took me under her wing. His friends, once strangers, welcomed me with open arms, teasing Mason about finally finding someone who could keep up with him. One night, over a candlelit dinner at a small Italian restaurant, Mason took my hand and said, "Lily, I don't care about your past. All I care about is building a future with you and this baby. You're my family now." It was the kind of moment I'd only ever dreamed of. For the first time, I let myself believe that happiness wasn't just something that happened to other people, it was something I could have, too. Mason proposed on a chilly evening in late February. We were walking along the beach, the waves crashing gently against the shore, when he stopped and turned to me. "I don't want to wait," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Lily, you're everything to me. Let's make this official. Marry me." Tears streamed down my face as I said yes, my heart full of a joy I hadn't felt in years. He slipped the ring onto my finger, a simple but elegant band that felt like it belonged there. The night of our engagement was perfect, dinner with close friends, laughter, and plans for the future. As we drove home along a quiet stretch of highway, Mason reached over to squeeze my hand, a content smile on his face. But in an instant, everything changed. The car that came out of nowhere, the blaring horn, the screech of tires, it all happened so fast. Mason swerved, his only thought to protect me. When the car finally came to a stop, the silence was deafening. I remember screaming his name, reaching for him, my hands trembling as I tried to wake him. The paramedics arrived quickly, their voices urgent as they worked to save him. But deep down, I already knew. Mason was gone. In the days that followed, I struggled to process the loss. The man who had given me hope, who had shown me that I was worthy of love, was gone. And yet, even in my grief, I could hear his voice in my mind, urging me to keep going. "You're stronger than you think, Lily," he'd always say. "Don't let the world break you." As I stood at his funeral, my hand resting on my growing belly, I made a silent promise to him. I would honor his memory by being the best mother I could be, by building the life he had envisioned for us. Losing Mason was the hardest thing I've ever endured, but his love gave me the strength to keep going. He had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself, and now, it was my turn to carry that belief forward, for myself, for my child, and for the life Mason had dreamed of building together. Every day, I find little pieces of him in the things he left behind, a half-finished crib, the books he'd picked out, the quiet echoes of his laughter. And though he's no longer here, his love remains, a guiding light that helps me find my way in the darkness. Mason taught me that second chances aren't just about starting over. They're about building something stronger, something real. And though I wish he could be here to see it, I know he's still with me, in every step I take toward the future we'd planned together. Because love like his doesn't end. It carries on, shaping us, healing us, and reminding us that even in the face of loss, there's always hope. In the weeks and months following Mason's death, the weight of grief was almost unbearable. It wasn't just his absence that I mourned, it was the realization of everything I had taken for granted. Mason's love had been unconditional, steadfast, and forgiving, qualities I had so desperately needed but didn't fully appreciate until it was too late. Sitting in the quiet nursery he had started building, I often found myself overwhelmed with memories of him. The little touches he had added, the bookshelf filled with bedtime stories, the soft mobile he'd picked out, reminded me of the man who believed in second chances, even when I couldn't believe in myself. His words lingered in my mind like a mantra. "Lily, you deserve to be loved and to start over, no matter what you've been through." Those words became my lifeline. They carried me through the darkest nights, when guilt and despair threatened to consume me. I knew that if I truly wanted to honor Mason's memory, I couldn't stay stuck in the past. I had to change, not just for myself, but for the child I was carrying, for the future Mason had envisioned for us. A few months later, I moved out of Charleston to a smaller town in North Carolina, seeking a fresh start. It wasn't easy leaving behind the places that held so many memories of Mason, but I knew staying there would keep me trapped in a cycle of grief. I found a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood and started focusing on building a life that Mason would have been proud of. One day, I signed up for a seminar called Rebuilding Your Life After Loss at the local community center. I was nervous walking into the room, unsure of what to expect, but I knew I needed guidance. That's where I saw her, Linda. Linda and I had been childhood friends, growing up on the same street and sharing dreams of big cities and better futures. Life had taken us in different directions, and we'd lost touch over the years. But there she was, standing at the front of the room, leading the seminar with the kind of confidence and warmth I barely remembered from our childhood days. After the session, I approached her, unsure if she'd even recognize me. "Linda," I said hesitantly. "It's me. Lily." Her eyes widened in surprise, and then she smiled, pulling me into a hug. "Lily. Oh my gosh, it's been years. How are you?" Her warmth was infectious, and before I knew it, we were sitting in a corner of the room, catching up on everything that had happened in our lives. Linda had become a community leader and philanthropist, dedicating her life to helping women who, like me, had faced challenges and made mistakes they wanted to move beyond. She shared her own struggles, how she'd built her life from the ground up after a messy divorce, and how she'd found purpose in helping others. As we talked, I opened up about my own journey, the mistakes, the losses, and my determination to change. Linda listened without judgment, nodding thoughtfully as I spoke. "Lily," she said gently, "you've been through so much. But you have so much potential to turn it all around. The mistakes you've made don't define you, they're lessons. Use them to build something better, something meaningful." Her words struck a chord deep within me. For so long, I had been consumed by shame, convinced that my past would forever overshadow my future. But Linda's encouragement made me realize that I still had the power to write a new story for myself. "Come work with me," Linda offered. "We're always looking for volunteers to help with our programs. You'd be great at connecting with other women who've been through tough times." I started volunteering with Linda's organization the following week. At first, it was just a few hours here and there, helping organize workshops, lending an ear to women who needed someone to talk to. But as the weeks turned into months, I found myself drawn deeper into the work. Helping others gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't focused on what I could gain, I was focused on what I could give. And in giving, I began to heal. Linda became not only a mentor, but also a friend, someone who believed in me when I struggled to believe in myself. The pain of losing Mason never fully disappeared, it lingered like a quiet ache, a reminder of what could have been. But instead of letting it weigh me down, I used it as fuel to keep going. I wanted to be the person Mason had seen in me, the person he believed I could become. As the months passed, I felt myself growing stronger. I enrolled in classes at the local college, taking courses in social work with the hope of eventually turning my volunteer work into a career. I also began preparing for motherhood, attending parenting classes, and setting up a new nursery for the baby. One afternoon, as I was folding tiny clothes and placing them in a dresser, I felt a quiet sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the future. I didn't know what it would hold, but I knew I was ready to face it. The story of my life isn't finished, it's still being written, one day at a time. There are moments when doubt creeps in, when the weight of the past feels heavy, but I remind myself of what Linda said. Let your mistakes teach you, not define you. And I remember Mason's words, the unwavering belief he had in me. You deserve to be loved and to start over, no matter what you've been through. With those words as my guide, I'm choosing to move forward, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with hope. Hope that I can create a life filled with meaning, a life where my child can grow up knowing love and kindness, and a life that honors the memory of the man who taught me the power of second chances. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: no matter how many times we fall, we always have the choice to get back up and try again.